All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what exactly is Redux. Redux depends on how you look at it. If you simply go to the redux.js.org, you're going to find out that Redux is a state container, a global state container, meaning whatever you put in the Redux can be accessed by other components. You will see that Redux is mainly used, although it can be used with anything you want. It's an independent kind of like a framework, but it's mainly used with React applications. So if you are writing React applications, whether it is for web interface or for React Native, you can use Redux. But as I said earlier on, Redux is independent. It doesn't really care what kind of a framework that you are using. If you need something, some sort of a state container where you can store global data, Redux can be your choice. Now, how will it map to the real world application? I mean, what kind of a problem the Redux is trying to solve? So let's go ahead and take a look at the problem that Redux is trying to solve and how Redux solved that particular problem. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a real world example of where Redux global state can benefit us. This is our view of the different components. You can think of it as different views and a hierarchy of views. You can see we have a one view at the very top. That's kind of like the parent or the content view. And inside over there, we have multiple view hierarchy going on. Let's say that one of the views changes the isAuthenticated property to true. It was false, but now it's true. And there is some other view who is interested in that particular change. So how can we get that property isAuthenticated true all the way to the completely different side of this view hierarchy? Well, one way would be for the child to give this to the parent, and then again to the parent, and then to the child, and then to the person who was asking for. I mean, this is quite possible in your SwiftUI application using something called binding. But you can see it's quite messy, and if our hierarchy was much deeper, then you have to pass to the parent, 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 child, 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 and that's a mess. So how can we do it in a different way? Well, what we can do is we can create a Redux global state container. And anyone who is interested in sharing the information globally, they're just going to write to the global state. So that particular component is just going to write isAuthenticated true to the global state. And now, whoever the component is, they are interested in reading that value, well, they're just going to read it right there from the global state. Now, one other thing to remember from a SwiftUI point of view, and it also happens in React when you're working with web application or React Native, is that whoever view is looking at or subscribe or interested in a particular slice of the state, which means isAuthenticated true, or some other slice representing a list of movies or something, they will get the re-rendering again when the actual state changes. So this means that if there are three different views they are subscribed to, they're looking at isAuthenticated property, which is stored in a global state. And if somebody changes from that property from false to true or true to false, then all of those three different views are going to get updated. And that is what makes your views sync with the global state. So now that you have an idea of what exactly is Redux, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the different moving parts of Redux. Now, before we do that, I do want to tell you about my brand new website, which is awesomesharp.school. Now, this is one of the largest catalogs for iOS development videos. Let's go and check out some of the courses. You can see that I have courses for everything that you can imagine for iOS development, including full stack iOS development using Vapor, reactive programming using Combine, Core Data Bootcamp, Swift Data Bootcamp, MV Pattern, server-driven UI, test-driven development, even machine learning. And apart from the courses, which you can actually purchase for a very low price, you can also become a member. And this is what most of the people do. They just become a member monthly, $25, annually, $249, and they get access to 22 plus comprehensive courses, which are 130 hours. And they also get access to all the future courses. So definitely check out azamsharp.school. This is your number one resource for iOS development. Now let's go ahead and get back to the video. Let's go ahead and take a look at different components of Redux design pattern. You're seeing that we start everything from the view. This is your SwiftUI view, or this is your React component. We start with the SwiftUI view or the React component, the view. The view dispatches an action. Now, what exactly are actions? We're going to take a closer look at actions later on, but we dispatch an action to update the global state. So if you can think of, if you're creating a counter application where you press a button and you update the value of the counter in a global state, then the action will be responsible for being dispatched and going all the way to the reducer to update. Right now, we can ignore the middleware. We're going to talk about this later. Don't worry about this too much right now. So a view is going to dispatch an action. That action is going to go all the way to the reducer. And reducer is the only thing that can update the state. And what we're doing is that we're not taking the value and appending something to the state. We are creating the brand new state. That's the whole point of using Redux design pattern, is that you are never really updating or adding or removing items. You're always replacing the whole state with the brand new state. So once again, we're going to start with the view. This will be a SwiftUI view. It's going to dispatch an action. Maybe it wants to increment a value in the global state. Maybe we want to add a name to an array in the global state. That action is going to reach all the way to the reducer, and the reducer is going to update the global state. As you can see over here, we can actually have multiple reducers. But in the end, all those reducers combine together to create one single root reducer. And in this course, you will actually end up creating multiple reducers, but you will see that all of those reducers kind of like combine together into a single reducer. So now that you have an idea of the whole state or the flow of the application, the flow of Redux design pattern, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the store, the reducers, action, and middlewares. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about store and reducers. A store is initialized using a reducer and a global state. So without the reducer, you cannot initialize a store, and without the global state, well, the store doesn't have anything to work against. So make sure when you are creating the store, you are passing in at least a reducer and a global state. A store may also contain a middleware or a list of middlewares. We are going to take a look at what exactly is middleware later on, but it is an optional argument you can pass in. One of the jobs of the store is to dispatch an action. The action will eventually reach reducer where the state will be updated. It is also store's job is to notify the listener of the state changes. Now in SwiftUI, this can be done by using just the observable object and having a state property marked with publish property wrapper. We're going to also see that in the future, but that is how the store can notify all the listeners that the state has been updated or it has been replaced with the new state. Now let's go ahead and talk about the reducer. It is the job of the reducer to update the state, and one very important thing about the reducer is that it is the only thing that can update the state. The reducer can also update parts, also known as slices, of the state based on the dispatch actions. This means that maybe you are updating just the user is authenticated flag, but maybe the reducer is also updating only a part of the state, meaning the movies in an array. An app can consist of multiple reducers. So one app that you're designing can consist of 10, 15, 30 reducers, but in the end, all of them join together to form one reducer, also known as a root reducer. So now that you have an idea of the store and the reducer, let's move forward and check out some other components of the Redux design pattern. Let's go ahead and talk about state and actions. So how exactly is state represented in our Redux design pattern when we are using Swift language? Well, a state can be represented by a global state called app state. This can be a very simple structure which can have properties like is authenticated, counter, or a list of movies or other items that you want to put it in the global state. Now, sometimes what happens is that you may have too many items in the global state or the root state, and you want to separate them out into corresponding slices of the state. So let's take a look at an example where we have the app state, but instead of putting the movies into the app state, we will put the movies into a movie state. And the app state can simply refer to the movie state. So this is going to give us more flexibility. Like if the movie state is growing and maybe we are now capturing TV shows or recommended movies or a list of other movies, or we want to filter it out, then we can simply add that to that state. Now let's talk about actions. Actions are those things that go from the view. They take the data sometimes and they are dispatched, meets the reducer, and the reducer looks at the action and then it updates slice or part of the state. In this action, which is called the fetch movies action, you can see that this action consists of the search, and which is the string. So you're probably searching for a particular movie like Batman, Spider-Man, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit. And you can have another action called set movies action, which will be fired once you have the movies in your hand. And this action can be calculated. This action can be evaluated by the reducer. It can take out the movies and put it in the global state. So these actions will reach all the way to the reducer, and the reducer can take out the data, also known as a payload, from these actions and then update the global state. Now the action always does not have to have some sort of a payload, like over here you can see I'm passing movies, but sometimes the action can be just an action, like an increment action. And whenever this kind of action reaches a reducer, the reducer can then look at the action and simply increment the global state counter value by 1. So in this case, we don't really want to or have to pass in some additional payload. We can simply look at the type of the action and perform some action. Let's go back to the same exact Redux flow diagram and try to understand that what exactly is the job of a middleware. Now we know that when we start with the view. The view dispatches an action. The action goes all the way and it reaches the reducer. That's great. But sometimes what we want to do is we want to load data, we want to fetch data from an external resource like some sort of an API. So how can we do that? How can we perform an action over here into the view which produces an action and then fetch something from an API and then go all the way to the reducer? If we try to do that inside an action, we're not going to dispatch another action later on, because inside the action, you cannot really dispatch. So the middleware now come into play because middleware is just a piece of code that is going to be fired after the action has been dispatched and before it reaches the reducer. So this is a very good opportunity for us to load something from an API, and once that thing is loaded, we can dispatch an action. So inside the middleware, you can dispatch an action, and that capability of dispatching an action inside the middleware allows it to wait for the result from an API. And once we get the result from an API, we dispatch an action which goes to the reducer, and the reducer finally updates the global state. Keep in mind that although we do have middleware, it is the responsibility of the reducer to update the global state. The middleware is simply fetching some data from an API and then dispatching an action which reaches reducer and which then updates the global state. So that's the whole point of middleware, and you can have a list of middlewares. One middleware might be fetching a list of movies, the other middleware might be simply logging the events. It simply depends on what you're trying to do. We are going to look more closely to the middlewares later on in the course. We'll start with the basic setup of the middleware, and then we'll jump into performing an actual API request using middlewares.